There's nothing more basic, and I think, to being a follower of Christ, but especially I hope what is true of Restore. And not that it's unique. I think all gatherings, all fellowships, all churches have love as a central piece, but I hope the way that we practice that and the way that we think about and the way that we live, loving each other and loving God, at least maybe not unique, but helps us do our mission better. And so today I wanted to talk about that. That's, I think, there's nothing more basic, nothing more simply part of who we are than this idea that we need to love each other, that we need to love God and love each other. And I love this story. Very simple thing. I'm sure I can drag it out and give us a good, too much time. But just the beginning of the story here where Jesus is teaching around, and there's some Pharisees and some Sadducees, kind of two of the, there's a lot of parallels to the world, kind of religious, political entities that are kind of on all opposite ends, but the one thing they had in common is they really did not want Jesus coming in and messing up their system. So they always were trying to trap him. They were trying to come up with some ways to get Jesus to say something that would, A, be offensive to the people, so that people quit following him, and maybe catch him out and be able to prove him wrong. And of course, Jesus was never caught by that. And not because he was more clever. Of course, he's God, he's more clever. But also because he was just lived what is true. So we start here in Matthew 22, verse 34 to 36. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, so this would be like when the Republicans heard that Jesus had silenced the Democrats, they're like, yeah, now's my chance. Or when the Pentecostals heard that Jesus had silenced the Baptists, right? They're all excited. Now they get their shot. They silenced the Sadducees with his reply. They met together to question him again. So now can you kind of imagine what that's like? They're huddled up. They're whispering questions back and forth, and they kind of push one guy forward to be the spokesman. And then one of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, what is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? There are like 600 and some laws of Moses. And they were split up into things you had to do and things you were not supposed to do. Things laws of requirement, things you do, and then things you're not allowed to do. And they were like, we're going to trap him because this has been a debate. This is not a new question. And they're going to trap him and see if he goes with the ones that they wanted. Because, of course, the Sadducees and the Pharisees both emphasized different parts of the law. And so they were hoping that if he said this side, they could point and say he was favoring one side or the other, or he had missed the boat because they had all sorts of reasons why certain laws, certain practices, certain behaviors were the most important. And, of course, he responds this perfect way. So the first thing is love God. He says, in Matthew 37, verse 37 and 38, Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then shuts him up. And we have heard this. I talk about this all the time. This should be a cornerstone of what we believe, right? Way back to when we were Cornerstone. That at Restore, this is who we are. This is what we say is the filter through which we look at every relationship, every doctrine, every piece of theology, everything that we do. We want to say, the first point is that we love God. But why did this catch them out? Why did this silence them so quickly? They had all sorts of arguments by which the hierarchy of rules, the hierarchy of commandments, the hierarchy of these covenants, how did this silence them so much? There's a couple of reasons. But before we get that, I want to define love. I've done this a few times. I Googled and looked at different dictionaries and even some religious, some commentaries. And there's kind of this idea that love is defined as an intense feeling of deep affection, or a quality or feeling of strong or consistent affection and dedication to another, desiring closeness and involvement and intimacy. So I want us to keep that in mind, this idea of deep, intense affection and a desire for closeness. And he says the first most important thing is to have love toward God. Love God with everything that you are. And I think one of the reasons that this silenced the Pharisees is because he's quoting Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 6, it says this, Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Jesus is quoting this passage, this law, this idea of this is the main law, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. And I love, though, that also then it goes on and saying how important it is that you need to share this with your kids, raise them in understanding that the most important thing is loving God. And you do it so much that you're going to write it down, that you repeat it, you talk about it all day long, how you want to love God. And so much so that you'd write it literally on your forehead or write it on your hand, and it'd be the entryway to your home or your property. And they miss the point completely. Because for generations after that, they started to wear those words, love the Lord your God, on their forehead, on a little box on their forehead. Or they'd write it down and they put it on a little box on their door frame. Now again, I'm not making fun of that practice. It is a great practice if it's genuinely reminding you to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. It's not a great practice if then you don't have to love the Lord your God because you put it on your doorpost. Or you've written it on a piece of paper, on a Post-it, and put it on your forehead. And then you can forget it. And I gotta admit, I think that's kind of what began to happen. And I think that's kind of what happens to us. We know something, we believe it, we affirm it, it means something at one point, and as time goes on, we go through the motions, we go through the rules, we follow the idea, but we don't live it. Writing down, I love God, does not mean that we have deep affection and a desire for closeness. I love even further as I read a little further in Deuteronomy 6. Why do they love God? He says this later. He says, in the future your children will ask you, what is the meaning of these laws and decrees and regulations that the Lord our God has commanded us to obey? Remember, they had already said, the biggest one of all these rules and regulations and commands, the whole point of that is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Remember, that's the point. And so when the kids are saying, why do we got to do all this other stuff? Then you must tell them, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. But the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his strong hand, and the Lord did miraculous signs and wonders before our eyes, dealing terrifying blows against Egypt and Pharaoh and all his people. And he brought us out of Egypt so he could give us this land he had sworn to give our ancestors, and as the Lord our God commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear him, so he can continue to bless us and preserve our lives as he has done to this day. For we will be counted as righteous when we obey the commands of the Lord our God has given us. Why do they love God? Why are they commanded to love God? Because they're saying, here's the point. Not that all those rules make us better, because God rescued us. God rescued us. God loved us so much that he used his strong hand to bring us out of slavery. When we talk about why we love God, we need to remember that God has rescued us. Let's remember those times, that place that we were in our lives, personally and as families and as a group, that God has rescued us. The goodness and the power and the love of God. And so rather than focusing on following all the rules and making sure that we know exactly every single piece, we remember, why do we love the Lord our God? Because it's commanded, but also because he has rescued us. Why do we tell our children to love God? Because I said so? No. Because he has rescued us. You guys know my story. Whenever I begin to get discouraged, and there are times, believe it or not, I know it's hard to imagine, that I can become sometimes just walking through the motions. Sometimes being a pastor feels like a job, because it is a job. But you know what helps me remember is that I was rescued. When I start to get judgy of somebody, when I start getting frustrated, when I start looking across town at another church and go, why are they doing that? I remember, wait, no. I was rescued. I was rescued. And maybe we don't all have a story of atop that testimony, right? But we can remember how we were rescued by God. Mark gives slightly different account to the same experience in Mark instead of Matthew. It says this, and I know it is important to love him with all of my heart and all of my understanding and all of my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. This is more important than to offer all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices required by the law. Hey, what pales in comparison to getting it right all the time? Loving God and loving people. So I have some thoughts about this. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commands, obey him. If we want to love God, how do we show that? How do we do that? I think we obey him. Follow and do what is important to God. Not the old covenant, not the old rules, or amassing influence for God in God's name. Man, I think we get confused with that. That we begin to shout what is right, and we think the best way to love God is to make sure everybody knows how wrong they are. God can do that on his own. We need to love God and obey his commandments. And what are his commandments? Love him with all of ourselves and love others. We're to love him. How do we know if we're ever weak? This was so convicting this week as I was kind of pondering this and writing this. I got to admit, I rewrote this 3 or 4 times because I kept finding new things. So I hope I made a conscious choice. In fact, I promised Deb as I was working on this yesterday, I was like, I have to edit some stuff out because I don't need to put everything I think every Sunday in every topic. So there's plenty more. But this is what got me this week. That we're to love him with all of our heart, our emotion. We are allowed to feel it. I got to admit, my faith, especially kind of in college. Now, I didn't experience this when I was growing up. In my home, emotion was important. We were allowed to feel, and that was encouraged, and talk about emotion. But when I got to college, in Bible college, they kind of made us feel like emotions were bad, that if you were just feeling something, you needed to suppress that and hold on to only what is intellectually true, what you believe, what you assent to. And no, what does God start out with? Hey, love me with your heart. Love me with your emotion. And that's not something we conjure up. That's because if we are close to God, we're going to feel it. If we know God, we're going to have a passion behind it. Allowing affection and even fear at times, rather than just avoiding and distrusting emotion. It's okay to actually feel the love of God and to express the love of God with emotion. That's why when we have music, it's so important. It allows us to experience the emotion of loving God. Whether it's art or music or poetry, or how about sometimes we're supposed to shout it out. When was the last time you shouted out how much you love God? That's an expression of emotion. There are times I've shouted at God when I wanted him to do something different or I was in pain, and I think that's okay. That's loving him with my heart. I think God can handle it when we experience emotion. We're supposed to love him with all of our soul. This idea, that's kind of the decision-making, the spiritual, the mystical, and the motivational, the eternal part of us. It's the part of us that makes decisions and the part of us that is mystical. And I think in my tradition, we were wary of that. We're wary of this idea of anything that's spiritual beyond what we can kind of define and put a box in and explain. But we're to use that. God reveals himself to us and connects with us and connects with the eternal. I've tried, the words don't even come to me, the eternal personal side of me. The part of me that goes on forever, the part of me that is me, the life beyond my physical and understanding, the spiritual center of who we are. Not separate from the rest of me, but very much the real part of who I am. That needs to connect with God. I need to allow my soul to connect with and be with and pursue God. With our mind, of course, with our intellect. Yes, what we know, what we believe, what we read, what we study, knowing about him and learning more and relishing that. Sometimes I am really privileged to have a job where I get to do that, where I get to study. I have blocked out time where I have to. And there are sometimes it's study like school study. It's cranking away at looking up the Greek. But other times it is just rich. And I feel that. And there are moments when that's powerful, when I learn something new or there's an aha moment. And you know what? I would never get those moments. I would never be able to love God with my mind if I didn't actually start by studying. If I didn't enter into that, I wouldn't be able to experience those moments. And the same is for you. To study about God and to study God, to know what he really is like. And as I do that, he reveals himself to me and I love him even more. And with our strength, I think our strength is our body, our physical being. It's what we do. I need to love God with what I do. Our physical self in this physical world, our actions and our words and our impact needs to be loving God with the purpose of loving God. Essentially loving God and worshiping God with all that we are, all the time, every bit of us. And if we find ourselves wanting to increase our love for God, maybe look at those areas. How can I love God? Have I expressed emotion recently? Am I feeling it? Have I studied recently? Do I have a mystical part? Do I have the soul of me, the eternal part that's longing for the eternal God? Every part of me, experiencing and believing and feeling and doing all the things that make us human, all need to be directed at loving God, desiring connection with God, desiring closeness that he invites us into. When we love somebody, when we are in love, it entails connection. It entails proximity. We want to be around God. We want to welcome God into all areas of our life. We don't keep a little bit for ourselves, and then other times want God in this part, but I want to keep this part to myself. We need to work against that. Invite him into all areas, even ones that we're scared of, even ones that we're frustrated with, to invite him in. And the fear of God is important. We don't talk about this often. I think it's easy sometimes to talk about fear when it says we fear God, that it's just respect or reverence. I think there's genuine terror. What happened anytime anyone was ever in the presence of God, whether in the Old or New Testament, any story where someone was brought into the presence of God, their immediate reaction is, well, kill me, I'm dead. I am nothing in comparison. I don't deserve, I cannot handle the holiness and the power and the greatness of God. But the fear we have, that is reality. The closer we get to God, there will be fear. But that fear is not because of God being angry. I got to admit, I never liked my mom being mad at me. And if you're watching this, Mom, I'm sorry, but you know it's true. I'm 55 years old and I'm still scared of my mom being mad at me. Right? We don't like someone being angry at us. We don't like somebody when we know we've blown it and that we've hurt them. We're not afraid of God because we're afraid that he's after us, that he's going to attack. But it's fear based on our self-understanding that when we are confronted with the holiness and power of God, it leaves us decimated. And not that we are worthless. The beauty of that is, though, that at the same time, he offers us comfort and grace and love. Almost all those passages where people enter into the presence of God and they fall on their face and say, destroy me. What's the very next line? Fear not. Yeah, I could, but I won't. I love you. You don't need to be afraid. All this power, all this holiness, all this grace, all that you see is used for your benefit, not for your destruction. The same power that makes us want to die in his presence, we can hold on to as the thing that carries us through. And then we don't need to be afraid of anything else. If an all-powerful and all-holy God loves us and cares for us, what else do we have to be afraid of? It's a visceral, uncontrolled response. There have been a few moments in my life where I've been confronted with just a tiny, how is it described? The passing of the shadow of God was enough to cause people to fall down. There have been a few moments in my life where I've had those moments where I've been deep in prayer. Something's happened in my life where I began to feel faint. Kind of one of the very first times as an adult that I honestly admitted my sin. When I was doing my fourth step, when I was doing my inventory in front of my sponsor, and started listing all the stuff. And fortunately it was with a believer who's a sponsor, and who said, now let's list the good stuff. And I almost passed out. Because it was safe to list all that stuff where I was unworthy. And then to list all the ways God had been gracious to me. Almost passed out. You know that thing where it's blank and it kind of goes to a pinhole? That happened. Just a moment, a flash, a glimmer of who God is enough to destroy us, and also enough to buoy us up and carry us through. And should draw us, the fear of God should make us love him even more. So if we're struggling with loving God, or we just don't know how, just a few little thoughts. Pray. Connection involves communicating. And prayer, just like we did today, be consistent and creative. Dave and Jean have a labyrinth at their house. A little prayer walk. Jim used to make me, once I got to the office, I like to just sit in my chair. And Jim would come around about once a week and go, let's go for a walk. And I'd be like, oh, come on. And we'd walk and pray. Maybe actually what I do now, because sometimes I'm alone in the office, is I actually get on my knees. Man, that helps. First of all, it keeps you awake. My knees hurt. I'm an old man. Be creative in our prayer. Pray with somebody. Pray by yourself. Make a list. Don't make a list. And more than just listing all the stuff to God, when you run out of stuff, then just be quiet. Let God speak to you. Worship. Worship. Express our love for God out loud. Maybe it's singing. Probably most of the time for most of us, that's how we know to worship. Sing loud. In your car probably would be the best place for most of us. Speeding down the road where no one can hear us. Right? But sing out loud. Or maybe some other form of art. Paint. Draw. Write a poem. Dance. Whatever it is. Worship out loud and consistently. Just as we're trying to find time to study the Bible and find time to pray, we need to find ways to worship. Express to God how much we love him. It kind of feeds on itself. When we begin to do that, it makes it easier the next time and it becomes more part of who we are and then becomes consistent. The same intensity of fear is the same intensity of God's love. As big as he is that causes us to fear, also should inspire us and encourage us to love back with that same intensity. How can we not love him with somebody, the power of God revealed and yet embracing us right where we are? So we need to let ourselves, the best way to really love God is let ourselves be completely loved by God. Acknowledge that he loves you without restraint, without condition, without waiting for you to fix yourself up, without you having to do one more thing, he loves you exactly as you are right now as much as possible. With all of his power and all of his deity and all of his holiness, he loves you with everything he has right now as you are. If you want to love God, admit that to yourself and live it. So God embraces us individually and as a group, as a church, and allows us to know him and be known. And God's love, he loves us perfectly. That then allows us to do number 2, is to love others, to love people. Matthew 22, verse 39. After he's already answered, what's the greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is equally important. I like this. It's not, so here's the top one and the bottom one. It's like, here's 1A and 1A. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as much as you, this is the Dave translation. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Protect your neighbor as much as you protect yourself. Care for your neighbor as much as you care for yourself. I was trying to think of maybe a better definition of love than Google gave me. And fortunately, you know what? There is one. I had the privilege a year ago March to officiate at Calvin's and Hannah's wedding. And of course, they wanted me to use 1 Corinthians 13. Let me just read that to us today. This is what love is. This is what we're supposed to love others as. Not just a spouse, but others. If I could speak with all the languages of earth and of angels, but don't love others, I would be a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy, and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but didn't love others, I would be nothing. If I gave everything I have to the poor and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it, but if I didn't love others, I would have gained nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, and is always helpful and endures through every experience. Prophecy and speaking in unknown languages and special knowledge will become useless, but love will last forever. Now our knowledge is partial and incomplete, and even the gift of prophecy reveals only part of the whole picture. But when the time of perfection comes, these partial things will become useless. When I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned as a child, but when I grew up, I put away childish things. Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything perfect with all clarity. And all that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. 3 things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. That's how we're supposed to treat people. That's how we're supposed to feel about people. Endures all things. Right? So it starts off with first, what is love not? What love is not. It's not winning. It's not being important. It's not fault-finding or assigning blame. I like that it says, don't be rude and demanding. And it's easy when we're talking about marriage, but I'm talking about how we treat everybody. Don't be jealous. Don't be irritable. Genuine love cares more. So much more important than anything else. We need to be patient and give grace and space. We need to be kind, to think the best. We need to never give up. We need to never lose faith and always be hopeful and endure everything. That's what love is supposed to be. So let's keep that high standard in our mind as we talk here for the next few minutes. Matthew 5 says this. Matthew 5:43. You've heard that the law says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way you will be acting as true children of our Father in heaven. I love this idea. I love this idea that coming right out and saying the quiet part out loud, we're kind of supposed to hate our enemies and love our friends. And Jesus is saying, nope, that is not what I mean when I say love. You're supposed to love everybody, even your enemies. The other story, and then I'll kind of recap, is the Good Samaritan. And we won't do the whole thing, but I think I have some of the verses up there. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him a question, again, trying to catch him. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? And the man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. Pretty good answer so far, right? And all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this and you live. But the man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, and think how clever he thought it was. Can you imagine this? And so who exactly is my neighbor that I have to be all this loving, that I have to do that whole list, that I've got to treat well, that I've got to care about and have deep affection for? Who exactly is my neighbor? Because I want to know, he wants to justify his actions, I want to know who I don't got to love. I don't think he was like, man, I really want to love, but I want to make sure I love the right people. It was like, I really want to make sure I get to hate the right people. Or at best, ignore the right people. And he tells the story, right, of the Good Samaritan. That a guy's walking along, he gets beat up by bandits, and a priest walks by, sees him lying there on the road, doesn't want to get dirty, so crosses the other side. A religious, like a lawyer, walks by, doesn't want to get involved, walks the other side of the road. And a Samaritan, who was literally their enemy, the religious enemy, stops, takes care of him, carries him to an inn, right? Fixes him up, pays for the innkeeper, and says, the next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man, and if his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. And then Jesus says to the guy, so out of the story, he tells the story, and he turns to the guy, and he's like, who asked, who was clever, trying to find out neighbor. Now, which of these 3 would you say was the neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits? Man, can you see the guy? The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus says, yes, now go and do the same. So if we're really to love people, if we understand the depths and the grace of God as he embraces us and loves us, this is how we're supposed to treat others. Love that actually looks like love and is acceptable and recognizable as love to others. Patient, giving time and space, kind, not rude, not giving up. I think we have tricked ourselves. We have tried to, just like this guy in this passage, Christians in this country, and I am sorry to say it, all too often, are looking for a loophole to find out who we get to hate. They're in the other party. They're demons. They're voting for him or her, and that means they can't be good. They wore masks during COVID. I will hate them. Or at best, I will ignore them. And I will laugh at them, and I will mock them, right? All of that stuff that we want to do. They go to the wrong church. They don't worship right. They take communion weird. We want to find out who's our neighbor. Who do we got to love? And this throws it out there. That's why Restore will always be a place where anybody who wants to get closer to God is welcome. And you guys know the stories. We have fringe people who are just putting their toe back in the water of thinking about knowing Jesus and have been asked not to attend, have been kicked out of other places, have been abused and treated poorly. And how many times have I heard that Restore is the only place they feel like they can go? And even here, they're like, I can go once every couple of months. And I say, praise God, that is our mission and that is our calling. That is our actual mission statement. You know that, right? To love others as we have been loved in an increasingly lonely world. We're to love everyone. We're supposed to love our neighbors. That's usually pretty easy next door. People who live in the same neighborhood. It's sort of like people in my situation who look like me, act like me. That should be easy. Even loving our neighbors, though, isn't easy. I live in a community that has an HOA. We got to have rules so that we can get along. You cannot put up your fence any higher than this, or we come down on you. Or you cannot put your trash bins in this part. You got to put it here. So even with our neighbors, sometimes we put restrictions on how much we're going to care. I got to admit, I love my neighbors. Sometimes I struggle with loving people who've lived in my house. I don't know if you've met my kids. They're charming people, but there are times that I have trouble when they were living in my house. I have conflict with people who live with me. Not Deb. Deb and I never have conflict, but those other ones. We make rules and we press for conformity, but getting along and looking alike does not mean we love each other. We all too often are just trying to get people to look like us so that it's comfortable. It's about loving me. But what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. But we're even supposed to love our enemies. If it's hard to love my neighbor, if it's hard to love my family, imagine loving my enemy. We're to be kind and patient and concerned for the well-being and enduring the suffering caused by those who are our enemy, who are actively working against us. The ones we disagree with that are different, and they're the opposite of what I like. And they don't follow the same rules or traditions that I do. In fact, they actively and aggressively oppose my likes and my way of life and my culture. It seems like I am supposed to love them. It seems like Jesus explicitly said, love your enemy. And I think we need to love them in a way that is recognizable. What do I mean by this? I have heard this many times by Christians. The most loving thing for me to do is to tell them how bad of a sinner they are. The most loving thing for me to do is to correct them. The most loving thing for me to do is to shun them so that they will feel hurt enough to come back. There might be times, I get it. Yes, there's times that there's I get all of that. But when we're trying to love people, let's not hate them and call it love to justify our actions. Loving someone is wanting what's best. If we're going to love them like ourselves, we want what's best for them. We advocate for them. And in fact, when we find people who cannot stand up for themselves, the guy who was attacked by the bandit, we actively work for their benefit. We find ways to tangibly care, to sacrifice our resources and our time, to go above and beyond, just like the Good Samaritan story. It would have been amazing if he stayed and bandaged him. It's even better that he went and put him in the hotel and had him cared for, and going above and beyond to saying, hey, if it's beyond this amount, I'll come back and take care of it. Advocating for those who can't help themselves. That should be what Christians are known for, not by what we're against. So we can love others because we love God, and we need to love others just as he does, right where they are. To actually care and think about it from their perspective. One of the ways we do this is subtle, is that we decide what people need. One of the difficulties they're telling me that I read about in this hurricane relief is people show up with stuff they want to donate, but they want it donated in their way, the way they want it and how they wanted it. Rather than saying, hey, I've got a truckload of water bottles, give it to whoever needs it. They decided this needs to go to this specific neighborhood or these people. Sometimes we look at somebody and we decide what they need. You know what we should probably do? A, listen to them, and B, ask them. Hey, what do you need? And then if we're able to help, help. Don't assume we know what they need. If we do, and even if we do, be gentle and convincing and patient and kind and not rude, right? All those things in 1 Corinthians 13. We need to advocate for others, even our enemies. Stand up to bullies. Christians should stand up to bullies. Loving our neighbors will be uncomfortable and inconvenient. Loving others, though, will be the blessing that helps us understand how much we are loved. When we're actually able to tangibly help somebody else, that lets us, it reminds us how loved we are, how cared for we are, and it encourages us to be able to do it more, just like worship does. Just like when we're doing anything positive, it encourages the next round. If you want to feel complete in your Christian life, love your enemy. So I'll leave us with this. The very end of this passage, Matthew 22:40, says this. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. All the stuff we try and get right. Are we loving God and loving people? May we be a people who love God with all that we are, body, soul, heart, and mind, all the time, so that we are able to love everyone as our neighbor. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.